and only the good die young. Whoa, 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 whoa. I tell you, only the good die young. Only the good die young. You got a nice white dress and a party on your confirmation. You got a brand new soul, and a cross of gold. But Virginia, they didn't give you quite enough information. You didn't count on me when you were counting on your rosary. Oh, 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 and they say there's a heaven for those who will wait. And some say it's better, but I say it ain't. I'd rather laugh with the sinners than cry with the saints. The sinners are much more fun. You know that only the good die young. Oh, baby, I tell you, only the good die young. Only the good die young.
Hello. We are doing this live recording. The time that this narration is being done live for Judith Miller's Germs book, Biological Weapons in America's Secret War, published September 7th or 9th, 2001. We're doing this live at 3:15 p.m. afternoon time, Thursday, May 8th, 2025. My name is Mark Kulak. Billy Joel. Might be appropriate to have Only the Good Die Young. I don't know. It was recommended by a show supporter, Christy, who I believe is in the chat right now live. This is episode 280.b, hexadecimal, so it's really 280.11 if you prefer, if you're old school like that. But 280.b, and it correlates to Chapter 11 in the book Germ is called Defenders. Defenders in the book starts on page 385. Oh, yes, today is Christy's birthday. Happy birthday, Christy. Thank you. You absolutely deserve that song then. Happy birthday to you. Thursday, May 8th, 2025. Here you go.
Defenders. Near the end of a hot, dry summer on August 23, 1999, Deborah S. Asnes, an infectious disease specialist at Flushing Hospital Medical Center, called the New York City Health Department with some distressing news. 2 elderly patients had come in with symptoms that seemed to be caused by a neurological illness: fever, muscle weakness, and confusion.
4 days later, she called again, and that's Deborah S. Asnes called again. Now there were 4 patients with similar symptoms. Though each of the patients had seen different doctors, and one was at a different hospital, Deborah Asnes found their complaints disturbingly similar, suggesting the possibility of a dangerous outbreak. Marcel Layton, that's Layton, Marcel Layton, who headed the New York City Health Department's Bureau of Communicable Diseases, told Deborah Asnes to send samples for possible testing to the State Department of Health. Marcel Layton also called the CDC in Atlanta. By the week's end, 8 cases of the mysterious illness were identified. Marcel Layton and her medical assistant, who had interviewed the victims' families, were struck by the fact that all of them lived within a 16-square-mile area of northern Queens and had spent time outdoors in the evening. Prime mosquito time. While the symptoms were consistent with viral encephalitis, a disease that mosquitoes can carry that causes inflammation of the brain, the severe muscle weakness affecting the patients was unusual for that ailment. New York City was considered among the best prepared in the country to detect and deal with a germ outbreak. After the 1993 bombing of the World Trade Center, Mayor Rudolph Giuliani had invested heavily in counterterrorism. New York was among the first cities to receive federal funds for training emergency response officials against attacks involving unconventional weapons. The city had spent more than $1 million on 2 mobile vans equipped to identify dangerous chemicals, but not germs, in the event of an attack. While most cities could barely scrape together tens of thousands of dollars for such precautions, New York had already spent millions a year building emergency response units, working out deals with regional hospitals for emergency care. Jerome Hauer, recruited by the mayor in 1995 to head a new office aimed at strengthening the city's defenses, had worked closely with the city's public health department to enhance the city's ability to respond to an unconventional attack. Jerome Hauer was especially concerned about the potential impact of a bioterrorism attack on New York, whose 24,000 people per square mile made it twice as crowded as the country's second most densely populated city, Chicago. A 50-year-old former emergency preparedness chief in Indianapolis who held a master's degree in public health, Jerome Hauer was one of the experts who had briefed President Clinton, again in that 1998 meeting with Joshua Lederberg and Craig Venter, on what steps the government should take to defend against biological attack. Soon after taking over the new Office of Emergency Management, Jerome Hauer had created a computerized system to track admissions to 11 city hospitals. New York had also begun training emergency room personnel to look for clusters of symptoms that could be caused by dissemination of anthrax or other germ weapons. In August of 1999, Deborah Asness of the Flushing Medical Center was performing exactly as Hauer had envisaged, aggressively investigating an unusual pattern of disease. Serum samples from Queens were forwarded to the CDC's facility in Fort Collins, Colorado, for more sophisticated testing. Dwayne Gubler, that's Gubler, Dwayne Gubler, an expert on disease spread by insects, and his scientists suspected that the cause of the illness might be St. Louis encephalitis, or SLE, which is often found in the southeastern United States. After checking the samples for antibodies against 6 viruses transmitted by insects commonly found in the United States, their tests came back positive for SLE, that's St. Louis encephalitis. The New York City Department of Health and the CDC announced on September 3, 1999, that their tests of blood and spinal fluid had supported the lab finding. The city's press release stated that the death of one elderly patient and the illness of 2 others in Queens were confirmed to be associated with St. Louis encephalitis, a viral disease transmitted by mosquitoes. Jerome Hauer announced the start of a $6 million pesticide spraying campaign to eradicate the city's mosquitoes. While there were objections to spraying large parts of the city with malathion, a potent pesticide, Hauer had little choice. New York had not experienced a major epidemic of mosquito-borne diseases in the 20th century, and the city, unlike neighboring New Jersey and Connecticut, had ended its mosquito surveillance and control program in the late 1980s. The city decided to spray large areas to kill the mosquito population quickly. There is no known vaccine or cure for SLE. In addition, Jerome Hauer's office quietly cornered the nation's supply of insect repellent. Some 400,000 cans were distributed by an army of 500 city employees at neighborhood firehouses and police precincts. His office and the city's health department wrote and printed 250,000 brochures about the disease in 8 languages and put information about it on the city's public health website. Health alerts and frequent updates were sent on a broadcast fax system to the city's hospitals. The mayor, Jerome Hauer, and public health officials held daily press conferences. City officials had reason to be pleased with their performance and relieved that the epidemic seemed relatively mild. By the time that fall's cooler temperatures ensured at least a temporary end to the epidemic, 62 people had become ill from the virus, most of them elderly, and only 7 of them had died. Thanks to Deborah Asness's rapid reporting and the health department's equally swift response, a diagnosis had been made in only 11 days. Record time. But there was, it turned out, a significant problem. The diagnosis was wrong. Clues pointing to the error came from an unlikely source. Since mid-August, wildlife veterinary pathologists at the Bronx Zoo had been worrying about a serious, but what seemed to be a separate biological event, the death of large numbers of crows and other birds. 4 days after the city's St. Louis encephalitis announcement, several exotic birds at the zoo were found dead. But not the emus. Boy, I'm sure Robert Malone and Jill Glasspool Malone are thankful for that. And that made Tracy S. McNamara nervous. Tracy McNamara, the head of the zoo's pathology department, knew that SLE, St. Louis encephalitis, which is carried by birds and transmitted through mosquitoes, does not normally cause disease in the birds that are its hosts. True, the dead birds had hemorrhages and inflammation in the brain, symptoms similar to those produced in people ill from SLE, but the birds also had badly damaged hearts and other affected organs. Tracy McNamara considered whether influenza or another common virus might be the culprit, as they caused similar symptoms in birds. But the pathology did not fit. Having taken a course in recognizing foreign animal diseases at the United States Department of Agriculture's Animal Lab at Plum Island, New York, Tracy McNamara knew that both these diseases would be affecting the zoo's domestic poultry, but the chickens were thriving. She also rejected the notion that mosquito-borne eastern equine encephalitis could be responsible, since EEE, that's eastern equine encephalitis or triple E, since triple E caused a different kind of inflammation and lesions in other part of the brain than what she was seeing in the birds piled high on her cooler. Moreover, the zoo's flock of emus, an Australian ostrich which is exquisitely sensitive to the triple E virus, was unaffected. So something more complicated had to be the cause. Convinced that the avian and human deaths were connected, Tracy McNamara sought help. Public health officials in New York later noted that she did not contact the Public Health Task Force, some of whose members were also uneasy with the initial diagnosis. McNamara said she had decided not to call the task force because it had no veterinarians and because the group lacked a secure laboratory in which her dead zoo bird and crow samples could be tested. Narrator's note, she just said she's stacking them up on her cooler. I guess her cooler is considered a biosafety level 3 or a BSL 4 cooler. Those are the really expensive coolers. So instead, Tracy McNamara sent off her samples to the United States Agriculture Department's National Veterinary Service Lab in Ames, Iowa. She also called the CDC to alert its scientists to the possibility that the birds' deaths and the human epidemic were linked. The CDC's lab at Fort Collins, overwhelmed with human samples from New York, dismissed her suggestion as unlikely and initially refused even to analyze her bird tissues. After all, birds were the natural hosts of flaviviruses, a group of pathogens known to cause encephalitis in people. Simultaneous outbreaks in humans and birds had never before been reported. Undeterred, Tracy McNamara sent them out to Colorado anyway. One more narrator's note. So it's too dangerous. You have to bring it to the right lab, but you're willing to leave it on your cooler. And also, what are you sending it FedEx? If there's some biological pathogen that's so deadly that it puts the life of everyone at the planet at risk, why are you sending it in the mail? The same thing happened with SARS-CoV-2. They took a sample, supposedly, this is the official narrative, whether or not it happened or not, I don't know, but the official narrative is they took a sample from Snohomish County man, the first person in the United States they thought had the COVID-19, and flew it across the country to the CDC in Atlanta. Well, what happens if the plane crashes? Does that mean we're all at risk of dying? You would think that a plane would be the worst possible place to put this pathogen. I mean, I want it in an armored truck, bulletproof, surrounded by a motorcade and tanks. The lack of consistency drives me crazy. Anyways, back to the book. Undeterred, Tracy McNamara sent them out, the bird samples, to Colorado anyways. Tracy McNamara was not alone in her convictions. Ward Stone, that's first name Ward, last name Stone, the chief wildlife biologist for the State Department of Environmental Conservation, had altered his veterinary counterparts in New Jersey and Connecticut to the strange illness that had struck the local bird population. But throughout the summer, the investigations of the bird and people illnesses seemed to be proceeding along mostly independent tracks. While the CDC eventually agreed to analyze some of her samples, Tracy McNamara complained that the agency workers had not returned her daily calls for almost a week. Struggling to diagnose the mysterious ailment that had appeared in New York, the doctors and scientists who focused on humans were slow to grasp the possible relevance of the birds' illnesses. In the federal government's planning for how a city might detect and handle a sudden outbreak of disease, officials had foreseen many different scenarios. No one, however, had anticipated an outbreak in which crucial evidence would be uncovered by a wildlife specialist. While Tracy McNamara had finally heard from the USDA, that's the United States Department of Agriculture, lab in Ames, Iowa, the news was alarming. The virologist could not identify the virus that was killing the birds. They had determined that the ailment was definitely some kind of flavivirus. But this was not a virus that veterinarians had ever seen before. Because no flavivirus had ever been known to cause disease in animals, neither the Ames, Iowa lab nor any other veterinary lab in the country had the testing material needed to pin down a specific diagnosis. Only the CDC labs and other public health facilities that did human testing had such reagents and chemicals. Tracy McNamara sent more samples of animal tissue to the CDC. With more than a dozen birds dead and more than 100 suspected cases of SLE, again, that's St. Louis encephalitis, reported, she also calls the United States Army Medical Research Institute of Infectious Diseases, USAMRIID, looking for a favor from an Army pathologist she knew. Explaining her theory that the human and bird deaths were linked, she asked him to examine her bird samples. The Army lab at Fort Detrick, Maryland, where Bill Patrick had once turned germs into weapons and which now was devoted to biodefense research for the military, did not normally take on civilian assignments. But the pathologist agreed, and 2 days after receiving Tracy McNamara's samples, the lab ruled out SLE as a source of the illness. An isolate of the virus that had been made by the USDA, along with more Bronx Zoo samples, enabled the lab to run other tests. On September 24, 1999, Fort Detrick and the CDC confirmed that a West Nile-like virus had been found in the bird samples. Tipped off by their findings, the CDC lab at Fort Collins used similar genetic fingerprinting techniques to analyze the human samples. At about the same time, tests were also being conducted by Ian Lipkin, the director of a University of California Irvine laboratory devoted to studying emerging diseases. He was in New York as a visiting academic researcher for whom state officials had asked for help. Ian Lipkin told the New York State and New York City health departments that the West Nile encephalitis virus had also infected the humans. On September 27, 1999, the CDC officially confirmed that a West Nile-like virus was responsible for the infections in humans as well as in the birds. The finding was astonishing. West Nile had never caused an epidemic in the Western Hemisphere. I'm going to add some additional color here. Let's go to Houstonic ITS, and let's go to the M's. And we have a page for Tracy McNamara because Wikipedia does not. This is Tracy McNamara. Now, Tracy McNamara, you can actually, I have a short video of her. This is actually September 22nd, 2011. Like I said, the movie Contagion, this is one of those little fun facts, was officially released on September 11th, 2011, 10 years to the day after September 11th, 2001. Just saying. But here's Tracy McNamara, who actually became a scientific advisor on the movie Contagion. Let's see what she says here.
It'll just be us here. Probably, but we'll see it.
Okay. That's okay. Go, Tracy.
She's in the credits. They're filming it in the woohoo! Whoa, did you see that? Who else was there? Nathan Wolfe. How about that? Mark Smolinski. Who else is covered in the movie? Connie Schmaljan. I know that she works a lot with Anthony Fauci. So these were the technical advisors for the movie Contagion. So that's interesting. So the scientist that found the dead birds, and through her persistence and grit and determination, made sure that the dead bird samples, after sitting on her cooler, were sent to a proper BSL facility after sending them by FedEx or UPS or something. DHL, I don't know what service she used. I don't think FedEx is considered a BSL-4 transport system. So they're all happy. Which, by the way, again, another narrator's note. If you believe this is a disease that's killing people, why the hell are you clapping and happy? Oh, people dying. I'm on the movie trailer. To me, it's a sign that they are lying. They know that they're not actually part of something serious. It is one of the biggest tells. If you believe you are part of something that murdered people, you should be so mad that you have to pray for the strength of God to not want to lash out physically against them. You don't laugh at it. Sometimes there's a little bit of gallows humor, but there's no happiness in it. And this laughter, the laughter, woohoo, Tracy, is disgusting. Let's watch the rest. Let's watch how happy Tracy McNamara is.
She's in a car.
No, so I always say I have a code. If I ever hear anything really awful and if I leave a voicemail for you, the code is the cats are in the car. Because that came out.
Oh, the cats are in the car. It's so funny. Oh, man. Next time thousands of people are dying, the code is the cat is in the car. It's
What's
so
not
funny.
that would get my cats out of the apartment would be something really.
Oh, my goodness. Now, Tracy McNamara has been on my research radar for a while. And oh, by the way, another fun fact, patient zero in the movie Contagion is Gwyneth Paltrow. And Gwyneth Paltrow is also an earlycovidsurvivor.com, earlycovidsurvivors.com. If you go to earlycovidsurvivors.com, you'll see that Gwyneth Paltrow was very, very high in the list of Americans who had COVID-19. Let's see here. I have her 6, within the first couple of months and survived. Now, she got COVID-19 and survived a week before Robert Malone got COVID-19 and survived. Adam Gartner got COVID and survived the same week that Robert Malone had it. Kendra Elise Becker-Mustaine, the one that was in the video with Brian Hooker and didn't recognize the death of Brandy Vaughn, whose name is misspelled on the CHD website. She got COVID in February 2020 and didn't die. Charles Rixey, he got COVID and didn't die on the first day of March in 2020. Milo Yiannopoulos got COVID and didn't die around March 12th of 2020. So Milo Yiannopoulos, Charles Rixey, Adam Gartner, Robert Malone, Kendra Becker, and Gwyneth Paltrow. Oh, and Dr. Ahmed Malik. Ahmed Malik was the first person in the UK that had COVID, by the way. Remarkable story of survival. earlycovidsurvivors.com. And they all got it. Steve Pachenik got COVID and survived before Gwyneth Paltrow did. Kevin McCarran was the first person to get COVID in all of Japan. He had it in December of 2019, and he survived. And Andrew Huff had COVID, and he survived in November of 2019. Amazing stories of survival here. Really. Jane Ruby also had it. Harvey Weinstein on March 23rd, 2020, he got COVID and survived. Matter of fact, Ian Lipkin. How about that? Ian Lipkin, that's someone who we're just talking about now also got COVID very early and survived. He had his COVID symptoms beginning March 19th of 2020. I have all of this stuff documented in my sources archived. Anyways, let's go back up. So the West Nile thing was in 2001, okay? And West Nile virus takes stronghold. I have the articles where she is quoted, along with Thomas Monath, who went on to become Robert Malone's boss at Newlink Corporation. Dr. Ann-Lisa Kilborn. So Ann-Lisa Kilborn also worked at the Bronx Zoo. And in fact, I've gone through the Bronx Zoo paperwork. This is the Bronx Zoo Wild Conservatory Guide Annual Report 1997. And if you go in through the paperwork here on who's reporting to who, we see that Annalisa Kilborn is right here and work with William Koresh. William Koresh, of course, goes on to be with EcoHealth Alliance and working side by side with Tracy McNamara, who at that time was the head of pathology, I guess. So the reason why Annalisa Kilborn working and co-authoring with Tracy McNamara so early is fascinating is because Annalisa Kilborn is another example of how only the good die young. Because at age 35, she died in a plane crash that was never recorded in Gabon in Africa. She learned how to pilot at a young age also. The three other people who were in the plane supposedly walked away. I don't know how that happened, but she as a pilot died. So they sent the body back to New York City, and several hundred people showed up at the Bronx Zoo. It was a shocking death. But what you should also know is that she also worked with Nathan Wolfe. Her work was also known by people such the people who went on to become the directors of Anthony Fauci's Vaccine Research Center. And also, and I suspect it was planted, she found some bones from a dead animal, from a dead monkey or a gorilla in Gabon in Africa. And I guess they did some testing on it, and supposedly the monkey or the ape died of Ebola. So the evidence that she was made to provide is the evidence that, to this day, Ebola is zoonotic. We know Ebola is zoonotic because of the evidence that came from Annalisa Kilborn. That's how we know Ebola is zoonotic. She found the missing link. She found the missing bone. And you can see it in a staged photo where she looks as uncomfortable as anyone has ever looked in a photo because she knew she was probably being part of some lie. And then she dies in a plane crash. She worked with Nathan Wolfe. And it's interesting because she worked directly for this belly-laughing chick, Tracy McNamara, who's the reason why I guess we know that the birds had West Nile virus, because she found some dead birds in the Bronx Zoo. Yet again, just like Brandy Vaughn, the story of Annalisa Kilborn is among the most damning and the most tragic stories. So anyways, getting back to the book here, the story of the West Nile virus and who it connects to, and the fact that Marcy Layton is also mentioned in here, add a little bit more color in here. One person that goes on to work extensively with Nathan Wolfe, who is co-authoring. He's co-authoring papers. Nathan Wolfe is co-authoring papers with Tracy McNamara, I believe before Tracy McNamara ever even found the dead birds. Let's verify that first, okay? April 1998. Nathan Wolfe, William Koresh, and Lisa Kilborn. So William Koresh is working with Tracy McNamara. I mean, look at this. Wild primate populations and research, infectious disease research link, the missing link. They use this paper. This paper is used to talk about the transmissibility of these stupid pathogens here. And William Koresh, EcoHealth Alliance, is also there. So William Koresh becomes one of the top collaborators of Peter Daszak. Nathan Wolfe becomes a top collaborator of Peter Daszak. Nathan Wolfe and Peter Daszak are collaborated as early as, 2004, 2005. Peter Daszak came to the United States, went to Georgia. His wife has some CDC role all the way as early as 1999. So after Peter Daszak co-authors two papers with the Anything But a Hero, Andrew Wakefield, in the UK in 1996 and 1997. Obviously, they're partners in some extent. Peter Daszak then comes to the United States, and then he's working with the people directly, okay, around this scientist who finds the dead birds that shows that we have a potential bioterrorist attack or something like that, or the potential of bioterrorism in New York City because Tracy McNamara finds dead birds. Peter Daszak was involved in this malicious lie that early, because that's when he did this career U-turn to become some sort of pathologist, tracking down animal viruses. And Andrew Wakefield in the year 2000, while Tracy McNamara is finding the dead birds in the Bronx Zoo, Andrew Wakefield is in the United States Capitol building in a hearing talking about the MMR vaccine. And Andrew Wakefield then moves to the United States permanently after 2001. After September 11th, 2001. I think he moved to the United States in December of 2001. Polly Tomey came to the United States of Children's Health Defense not long after that either. So this narrative control, maybe it's just the adjuvants nonsense, is also, it's that far away from what we're reading about here. Don't be fooled because Tracy McNamara doesn't have a Wikipedia page. I've already done the work on this. I've looked at those Bronx Zoo conservation guides. I know who she's connected with. And Ian Lipkin. I mean, for heaven's sakes.
Just over a month later, on September 27th, the CDC officially confirmed that a West Nile-like virus was responsible for these infections. Eventually, the virus would sicken 62 people and 7 patients would die. The finding was astonishing. West Nile had never caused an epidemic in the Western Hemisphere. The discovery unnerved many biodefense scientists and government officials who saw the New York outbreak as a dress rehearsal for a terrorist attack, a test of how well public health officials would cope with the sudden spread of a disease not typically found in the United States. Many felt that the summer's events highlighted several weaknesses in the nation's network for detecting emerging diseases. The public health system had performed well in many respects. An alert physician had reported the cluster of mysterious illnesses to the authorities, who in turn had quickly identified the virus's likely vector as mosquitoes.
Marcy Layton, or Marcel Layton, noted that had Deborah Asnis not done so, it was not clear when or if the outbreak would have been detected. Very noteworthy that there's a name that they don't want to say in here. They're cutting out mentions to a woman named Marcy or Marcel Layton. There is no Wikipedia page for her. She was born in 1958, and I have an interview of her. Yep, there's Marcel Layton. This is from probably 2000. She has dark curly hair.
The city had also taken swift action to stop the virus's spread, despite the initial misdiagnosis. The spraying of insecticide had contained the outbreak of the globe-hopping virus among humans. Because of the city's investment in bioterrorism defense, local public health and emergency preparedness officials knew one another and had worked together fairly well.
As Frank Young, the former HHS official, had observed, the site of a disaster was not the time or place for government officials to be exchanging business cards.
But the incident revealed some disturbing weaknesses. The daily conference calls involving as many as 100 officials from 18 different local, state, and federal agencies, often lasting up to 2 hours, left officials less time to deal with the crisis. In jurisdictional disputes, it was sometimes unclear which agency in which city, state, or county was in charge. Although the outbreak was relatively small, a study by the General Accounting Office, Congress's independent auditing arm, concluded that it had severely strained the resources of one of the country's largest, most experienced urban public health departments. If a relatively modest, naturally occurring epidemic had done that to the public health system of New York City, what would happen if a broader epidemic erupted elsewhere in the nation? The medical inquiry had also strained the federal government's limited lab resources.
The CDC's lab at Fort Collins had analyzed more than 2,000 specimens in 3 months, using almost all of the lab's capacity. And in 1999, Fort Collins was the only public health lab in the country able to diagnose the West Nile virus. In its report on the episode, the GAO, that's the General Accounting Office, was unable to determine the number of American labs that could safely handle such dangerous pathogens. But it concluded that the nation desperately needed more of these labs, with even greater capabilities.
The GAO and a Senate committee inquiry also concluded that the CDC had failed to abide by one of its own mottos in disease surveillance and control: expect the unexpected. In testing samples from the initial victims, the CDC scientists had screened for only 6 viruses common in this country. They had not tested for several that have been linked to foreign epidemics or germ warfare, among them West Nile.
American intelligence officials briefly considered the possibility that the West Nile virus had been unleashed against America as part of a biological attack. In April of 1999, a man claiming to be Saddam Hussein's former personal driver published a book in Britain that quoted the Iraqi leader as saying he one day might use the virus against his enemies. Experts eventually discounted the idea that the West Nile outbreak was a germ assault, but scientists were unable to trace precisely how the virus had made its way from the Middle East to North America. The New York variant of West Nile was almost indistinguishable from a virulent strain found on an Israeli goose farm in 1998 and similar to a strain in Russia's collection. Wherever it came from, the virus survived the American winter of 1999 to reemerge in insects and animals the following summer in a wide swath along the eastern seaboard. In the months that followed, public health and national security officials learned more not only about missteps in detecting and handling the outbreak, but also about the mysterious virus itself. Stephen M. Ostroff, that's Ostroff, Stephen M. Ostroff, the CDC's Associate Director for Epidemiological Science, said scientists discovered that some 78 different bird species had died from the lethal virus, and that between 1 and 2 million birds in the Northeast were believed to have been infected. West Nile had also been discovered in rabbits, squirrels, chipmunks, raccoons, bats, and even horses. While scientists had initially believed that the disease would not spread without mosquitoes, they now understood that birds could transmit it to one another without an intermediary. They also had learned that dead birds were the most reliable predictor of a human outbreak. New York had developed a, quote, dead bird density index, unquote, to calibrate responses to the virus. The more birds were found, the more steps public health officials would take. In a subsequent review, city health authorities were chagrined to discover that the human outbreak had begun much earlier than they had initially thought. Looking back over hospital records, it became clear that the first case had been seen as early as August 8th, more than 2 weeks before Deborah Asnis called in her report of a mysterious illness. Had the first case been recognized, some of the 62 people who contracted the disease, including the 7 who died, might not have fallen ill. Stephen Ostroff said the West Nile epidemic underscored the need for cities to create new systems to monitor symptoms associated with serious infectious diseases. Ostroff and others agreed that the CDC's reluctance to take Tracy McNamara's claim seriously and the lack of regular, respectful communication between the animal and public health communities had impeded a correct diagnosis. Scientists from both worlds subsequently met for the first time at a conference in Chicago to discuss improved cooperation. Tracy McNamara, the animal doctor, felt vindicated by the session, relishing the CDC's tribute to what it only half-jokingly called her dogged pursuit of the disease. Most importantly, the outbreak showed the importance of investing in public health. Much was now being learned and done thanks to a relatively modest increase in public spending. After the disease appeared, Washington allocated $25 million on West Nile virus-related research and treatment in the year 2000. Scientists at the University of Texas in Galveston were making progress on adapting a vaccine for West Nile from existing protections against Japanese encephalitis and yellow fever. Researchers at the Army Lab at Fort Detrick and the CDC were working together on a vaccine for West Nile. Tom Monath, there's a big chunk on him in the previous section, in Chapter 10, or Episode 280.A. Tom Monath, the scientist who had attended the meeting with President Clinton, was developing a vaccine at his company, AuraVax, which was bought by Acambus. Stephen Ostroff said, quote, "It's remarkable what you can do if you have the resources," unquote.
To White House officials, the missteps in tracking the West Nile virus were but one example of the practical difficulties they faced throughout the government as they struggled to turn President Clinton's broad commitment to germ defense into practical reality. Clinton's enthusiasm for the issue had translated into growing budgets for biodefense, and federal agencies were eagerly competing for their share.
But no one had overall authority over how the money was spent. Dick Clark continued to wield considerable power from his post as counterterrorism czar at the White House. But Dick Clark could not rewrite budgets or bring cabinet officers to heel.
Biodefense crossed every imaginable line in the government, sprawling across the Defense Department, Justice Department, Central Intelligence Agency, Department of Health and Human Services, and Federal Emergency Management Agency. It was what one veteran of the Clinton administration would later call an orphan mission, managed by everyone and no one. The Pentagon's effort to vaccinate American troops against anthrax ran into new difficulties in 1999. At military bases around the country, several hundred soldiers had refused orders to take the vaccine. A tiny percentage of the 200,000 servicemen inoculated in the initial phase of the program. The cases were nonetheless high profile, and the military moved to court-martial soldiers who resisted. Mark Zaid, a lawyer who represented some of the first soldiers to refuse the shots, had obtained thousands of pages of documents through his Freedom of Information Act lawsuit. Some undercut the government's categorical assertions about the vaccine's safety and efficacy. Zaid issued press releases about the documents and provided copies to reporters. In early 1998, Pentagon officials inadvertently broadened the rebellion with a decision they made in the name of fairness. The first round of vaccinations had been given to soldiers permanently stationed in regions that faced the greatest danger of biological attack, such as the Middle East. Reservists serving less than 30 days in such areas were not included. This made no sense to Pentagon officials who had been working for several years to integrate the reserves into military operations. Why should reservists be at greater risk in an anthrax attack? And so the Pentagon issued a new policy. Anyone serving in the Middle East or South Korea, even for a few days, would have to be immunized. The directive angered reservists, particularly pilots in the Air National Guard units. Many earned a comfortable living flying for commercial airlines. Unlike their active-duty colleagues who faced court-martial for refusing the shots, they could easily quit. Some did. Others complained to their congressmen. The issue caught the eye of Chris Shays, a Republican congressman from Connecticut. Shays was an odd duck among House Republicans, a former Peace Corps volunteer and New England moderate. He had used his post as chairman of a House subcommittee to hold hearings that pounded the Pentagon for its handling of Gulf War syndrome. Shays had a good sense of how to turn complicated issues into public dramas. His Gulf War hearings had pitted ailing veterans against officials from the Pentagon and the Veterans Administration. Shays assigned a longtime aide, Larry Halloran, to investigate the case of an Air National Guardsman from Connecticut who had quit the reserves rather than be immunized. Military officials claimed that the resignation was an isolated incident, but Halloran found 8 pilots from Connecticut alone who had left the Guard over the issue. His suspicions aroused, he asked the GAO to investigate the program. He also filed a request with the Pentagon for every scrap of paper in its files on the anthrax debate.
So while those hearings were in 1999, here's an article from the Clarion Ledger in Mississippi called "The Anthrax Vaccine Not Proven," and it reads, an expert testified Tuesday, and this is 2001, in an Air Force court-martial proceeding that an anthrax vaccine used by military was never properly licensed or tested. Merrill Nass of Freeport, Maine, a member of several hospital boards who had conducted studies on the effects of anthrax on humans, testified in proceedings at Keesler Air Force Base for Captain John Buck. I don't know if it goes on to mention the case with Halloran. It was being handled by Shays. But this concern that the anthrax vaccine doesn't work, waging war on the anthrax vaccine, think you'll find that Meryl Nass again, now we are Children's Health Defense again, has worked with Mark Zaid. Meryl Nass, Mark Zaid. Anthrax investigation summary by the United States Department of Justice. You search for Nass. And it's interesting here. Dr. Ivins was being subjected. This is a post 9/11 report, by the way. I think it was 2008 or later. Dr. Ivins was being subjected to increasing public criticism for his work. Compounding the intense professional pressure on Dr. Bruce Ivins was the increasingly vocal chorus of critics against him. Chief among these was journalist Gary Matsumoto, scientist Meryl Nass, and lawyer Mark Zaid, who blamed the anthrax vaccine for causing Gulf War syndrome, ailment suffered by veterans of the first Gulf War in the early 1990s. Through the end of the summer and into the fall of 2001, Dr. Ivins was expressing his increasing frustration with the criticism of the work he was doing. Here, they're critical of Bruce Ivins, who probably was, again, murdered. And they said it wasn't a suicide. It was no suicide. It was a murder. But it all comes down to this picture that's being painted, that they're just out to help the common man and the common person, if you will, and the military. They're just trying to protect the military from this awful anthrax vaccine. I'm not making a statement that anthrax vaccine, that old anthrax vaccine, was any good, that it was effective. But what I'm saying is that it was a very selective attack on the old anthrax vaccine. Just like the FDA or whatever had to come in and say the factory was bad. And then Nass and Zaid are saying the testing wasn't done. And then everyone making all this clamor. Oh, that old anthrax vaccine, the factory's dirty. They can't make it fast enough. We don't know if it works. Blah, 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 blah. People are going to make money. All right, I'm willing to buy that. But it's not the only game in town. Because if you look at this article here, and this was right after 9/11, this is October 29th, 2001. This was an article that was written by the Los Angeles Times medical writer. Vaccinations problematic. Anthrax and smallpox shots present manufacturing problems and dangerous side effects. So this is after the anthrax letters. And again, now there's more and more talk about the need for an anthrax vaccine. And Meryl Nass says, you won't see me getting in line for the vaccine. Well, that's nice. But she is only talking about the old anthrax vaccine. Because next to her is Daryl Galloway. We buy the individual some time to fight off infection. So Meryl Nass says, you can't take the old anthrax vaccine. Meanwhile, Daryl Galloway is saying, oh, but the DNA anthrax vaccine works. Meryl Nass never spoke out against the DNA vaccine for anthrax. In other words, she was laying the groundwork to use a DNA vaccine, gene therapy, and to help advance the Human Genome Project, should there have been a large-scale biological terror attack in a major U.S. metropolitan center. Again, if there was a biological terror attack, anthrax maybe, crop dusters, New York City, military has to take an anthrax vaccine. Meryl Nass was part, along with the Mark Zaid in this book, of saying that old anthrax vaccine is just horrible. But they never said anything that there was going to be an alternative. And the alternative was a DNA vaccine. And Daryl Galloway is a DTRA guy who, by the way, created a company called Daryl Galloway and Associates that hired for several years Robert Malone. In other words, Robert Malone was part of setting up an anthrax vaccine, a DNA anthrax vaccine, which would have been a top candidate should there have been a biological terror attack in a major U.S. metropolitan center, as well as the DTRA, which I did a whole chapter on, run by Andy Weber, etc., etc. Andy Weber and Meryl Nass go so far back as to September 11th in 2001, and the years before then, laying down the groundwork for why we were going to need gene therapy, something which would be so effing cool for the Human Genome Project benefit, should there have been a biological terror attack in a major U.S. metropolitan center. Oh, and after those anthrax letters were sent out, who was the person that was the primary suspect? Stephen Hatfill, who Robert Malone was co-streaming with on the Tommy podcast, of all places.
In 2022 and 2023.
How many people on the stage now,
As of 2025.
were involved in this control of which anthrax vaccine to use, all the way back in 2001, and anthrax letters and everything else, because they are all only one hop away from multiple parts of this Germs book that nobody will mention. And when I interviewed Meryl Nass, I said, hey, because I was stupid at the time. I said, hey, you must have worked with Joshua Lederberg. I was so excited. She was the first person I ever spoke to that I was certain would have worked with Joshua Lederberg, because after all, Lederberg was the chairman of the Gulf War illness trials. Lederberg chaired that. And Meryl Nass said, oh, he was before my time. I didn't know him. That's Meryl Nass not wanting to give any airtime to someone, Joshua Lederberg, who, if you looked at the work that he did, people would get so many insights about what the real nature of these engineered agents are. It would have been clear. They can make bacterium, they can make a lot of DNA and spread it around, and they can find ways to distribute phages to disrupt people's immune systems for a while and create a signal. Lederberg knew all that. Of course, Lederberg also knew that he was in Rome, and he had to live the life of someone who was in Rome, and I suspect do whatever he could, given the nature of things. And here we have 25 years later, CHD and Nass and Malone and the anthrax letter mailer suspect. And then Robert Malone knowing the person, Nancy Hagewood, who actually said that Bruce Ivins was the real anthrax letter mailer since 1989.
So we can get back to the book now. We'll expand on this in an additional 280 series deep dive.
The issue caught the eye of Chris Shays, a Republican congressman from Connecticut. Shays was an odd duck among House Republicans, a former Peace Corps volunteer and New England moderate. He had used his post as chairman of a House subcommittee to hold hearings that pounded the Pentagon for its handling of Gulf War syndrome. Shays had a good sense of how to turn complicated issues into public dramas. His Gulf War hearings had pitted ailing veterans against officials from the Pentagon and the Veterans Administration. Shays assigned a longtime aide, Larry Halloran, to investigate the case of an Air National Guardsman from Connecticut who had quit the reserves rather than be immunized. Military officials claimed that the resignation was an isolated incident, but Halloran found 8 pilots from Connecticut alone who had left the Guard over the issue. His suspicions aroused, he asked the GAO to investigate the program. He also filed a request with the Pentagon for every scrap of paper in its files on the anthrax debate. The committee chairman to whom Shays reported, Representative Dan Burton of Indiana, was one of President Clinton's most visceral opponents. A darling of the conservative movement and leader of the impeachment drive then unfolding, Burton never missed a chance to embarrass the Democrats. He was also a persistent critic of childhood vaccinations, questioning whether scientists were overlooking long-term side effects. Burton was delighted to have Shays' subcommittee examine the Pentagon's anthrax vaccination program. In April 1999, at a hearing before Shays' subcommittee, the GAO announced its preliminary findings, bringing to light some of the complexities that Pentagon experts had been quietly weighing for years. Kwai-Chung Chan, a GAO auditor, told the congressman that the long-term safety of the vaccine had not been studied. Therefore, one cannot conclude there are no long-term effects. Animal studies offered conflicting evidence of its efficacy against inhaled anthrax, Chan said, though it appeared the inoculations offered some protection. He told the subcommittee that the only human trials of efficacy had involved a similar but not identical version of the vaccine. Another GAO official, Sushil K. Sharma, contradicted the Defense Department's brochure on the vaccine, which said it had been safely and routinely administered in the United States to veterinarians, laboratory workers, and livestock handlers. In fact, Sharma said, the anthrax vaccine had been given to, at most, a few thousand people before 1990. General Eddie Kane, head of the Joint Program Office for Biological Defense, was sent to mount a defense. The vaccinations were going well, Kane said. Only 8 of 260,000 people receiving the vaccine had reported reactions that caused them to be hospitalized or miss more than a day of duty. The GAO offered no evidence that the vaccine was dangerous or a threat to health, but its testimony had raised some questions that did not have simple answers. Pentagon officials were shaken by the news coverage. Kane acknowledged in an email to a senior Pentagon official that the program had taken a hit. 2 key areas we came up flat were GAO's assertion that 1, the anthrax vaccine licensed was not the one tested, and 2, how can the Department of Defense say that reported Desert Storm illnesses were not caused by anthrax vaccine when we have no record of who received shots? If we cannot answer these questions, we, the Department of Defense and the administration, are in big-time trouble. In fact, the GAO was correct on both counts. Shays held 5 hearings on the anthrax issue in 1999 alone, taking more than 20 hours of testimony. Mark Zaid, the lawyer representing some of the soldiers who had refused shots, stirred more doubts when he came across documents the Army had drafted to indemnify companies making the anthrax vaccine. One document dated September 1991 said manufacturers were entitled to special protection because of the unusually hazardous legal risks in making such a product. Lawsuits could result from adverse reactions to the vaccine or if the immunizations proved ineffective, it said. The FDA's testing of the vaccine did not involve enough people to predict what would happen when it was given to large numbers of people. Only widespread use can provide this assessment, the document said. In addition, there was no way to predict whether it would be effective against the pathogens used in a biological attack. A later version of the agreement, written specifically for the Michigan lab, made the same points. Zaid provided the memos to a reporter from the San Diego Union-Tribune, who wrote a page-1 story. The Pentagon played down the significance of the documents, saying they were legal precautions comparable to a homeowner buying insurance against a fire. Soldiers reading them on the Internet drew different conclusions. A month later, the Pentagon promised to conduct a long-term study of the vaccine's safety, more than a year after the first shots were administered. Pentagon officials believed they could manage the problems on Capitol Hill. But in the latter months of 1999, the program confronted a more formidable challenge. Bioport, the company that had bought the Michigan facility, was having trouble meeting the FDA's standards. If production did not resume soon, the military would not have enough vaccine to go ahead with the immunizations.
The company was financially shaky. In August, the Pentagon agreed to raise the price it paid per dose of anthrax vaccine from $4.36 to $10.64. The rewritten contract gave the company an additional $24 million, or $18.7 million, of which would be paid upfront to tide over Bioport. Company officials said they had underestimated production costs when they bought the factory and negotiated the contract. The state of Michigan, it turned out, had been providing a much larger subsidy to the lab than had been understood. The bad news kept coming. The retesting after the 1996 FDA inspection cost Bioport more than 3 million doses. The reasons varied. Nearly 1.5 million doses did not pass potency tests. Others were rejected by the FDA because Bioport had failed to follow procedures assuring sterility. The shrinking reserves prompted the Pentagon to scale back the vaccine program.
But in November 1999, federal inspectors delivered another blow. The renovations to the Michigan lab had been finished in January of that year, but Bioport was still not ready to resume production. A new inspection report found more than 30 deficiencies.
The most significant involved the company's failure to comply with federal rules that each batch of pharmaceuticals meets the same specifications and is made the same way. Drug regulators had significantly toughened their standards since the 1970s, when the original license was granted to the Michigan Department of Health. They were now demanding much greater precision. If the original formula said the anthrax bugs should be allowed to grow for 22 to 28 hours, the modern FDA wanted a much more specific recipe, saying 22 to 24 hours, for example. Each change in the formula required a raft of tests to prove the product remained the same, and it was very slow going.
In December 1999, the Pentagon further slowed the vaccine program to stretch the dwindling supplies. Pentagon officials began looking at alternatives to Michigan. Some proposed building a government-owned facility, the idea that had been killed in the early years of the Clinton administration. But that would not bring any immediate relief. Officials estimated that it would take 7 years to build and license such a facility. Pentagon officials said that they hoped that Bioport would win federal approval for its production lines by the beginning of 2002, 4 years after the plant was temporarily closed for renovation.
Robert Myers, Bioport's chief scientific officer, said he was not daunted by the repeated setbacks. The FDA had toughened standards, and the Michigan facility was hardly the only company struggling to meet them. Still, he believed the production of anthrax vaccine would finally resume. Robert Myers, again, Bioport's chief scientific officer, said, quote, "In the end, rather than being the gang that couldn't shoot straight, we'll be known as the little engine that could," unquote.
In April 2000, Burton's Committee on Government Reform released a meticulously footnoted critique entitled The Department of Defense Anthrax Vaccine Immunization Program, Unproven Force Protection. The anthrax vaccinations, the committee concluded, were a well-intentioned but overwrought response to the threat of anthrax as a biological weapon. Gene splicing could produce new vaccine-resistant strains, making the program a medical Maginot Line, a fixed fortification protecting against attack from only one direction. By some measures, the anthrax program was a success. The military had inoculated more than 500,000 troops, with only a handful reporting significant side effects. A committee of outside experts set up by the Pentagon to study the reports of adverse events found only 16 instances of serious reactions out of 1,530 reports to the FDA by mid-2001. 11 people were hospitalized for swelling of the arm near the injection site. 4 servicemen suffered systemic reactions to the vaccine, but none went into shock. 1 temporarily experienced severe lung problems that ultimately healed. According to the committee of experts, none of the illnesses persisted. The rate of adverse reactions appeared to be low, comparable to or better than those for childhood vaccines. There were no reported deaths. But the Pentagon was nonetheless unable to sell many servicemen or key members of Congress on the value of the anthrax shots. The distrust stirred by the handling of Gulf War syndrome was deepened by the initial sales pitch for the anthrax program, and critics questioned whether the voluntary reports to the FDA captured the full picture. Many servicemen, they said, were afraid to disclose their illnesses, fearing that their military careers would be harmed. The Pentagon's initial public relations strategy proved deeply flawed in an era in which every relevant document, from the scathing FDA assessments of the Michigan facility to the reports about adverse reactions, was available through the Internet. Pentagon officials dismissed the opposition to the vaccinations as Internet paranoia. But in fact, as Mark Zaid often pointed out, the most devastating questions were raised by the Pentagon's own documents. "These are not my words," he would say, brandishing a memo. "They are yours."
Over time, the military gave soldiers more accurate information about the vaccine. The first fact sheet answered the question, "What are the side effects?" by mentioning only temporary maladies, such as sore arms or redness at the site of injection. In the fall of 2000, the Pentagon sent around a new version that was much more specific. It said, "Any vaccine can cause serious reactions, such as those requiring hospitalizations." For the anthrax vaccine, they happen less than once per 200,000 doses. Severe allergic reactions occur less than once per 100,000 doses. Pentagon officials acknowledged privately that they had oversold the program, particularly the broad claims about the vaccine's safety. A study completed in the year 2000 by a committee set up by the prestigious Institute of Medicine at the National Academy of Sciences concluded that there was, quote, inadequate or sufficient evidence to assess whether the anthrax vaccine was associated with long-term adverse health outcomes, unquote. It went on to say that there was a paucity of published, peer-reviewed literature which described a few short-term studies. The research most frequently cited by the Pentagon in support of the vaccine's safety, which was the monitoring of 1,590 employees at Fort Detrick who received immunizations, did not settle the issue, the panel said. Participants in the 25-year Fort Detrick study had not been specifically questioned about chronic symptoms.
In the years after the anthrax vaccinations began, some servicemen who had received the shots complained of dizziness, severe lethargy, and exhaustion similar to Gulf War syndrome. Government health experts believed the vaccine had not caused their illnesses, but as the Institute of Medicine made clear, more research was needed. The panel said its findings were an early step in the complex process of understanding the vaccine's safety. The effects of the controversy were clear. Hundreds of reserve pilots quit the military. By mid-2000, more than 400 servicemen had been disciplined for refusing to take the shots, and 51 had been court-martialed. A few served brief sentences in the brig. Some of the problems the Cohen team confronted in administering vaccinations against biological attack were inevitable. Doctors making the case for vaccines against dread diseases could point to measurable benefits that balanced the risks. For instance, before a measles vaccine was introduced in 1963, 500 children a year died from the illness. Deaths fell to 1 or 2 a year after children were immunized, a huge gain when compared with the tiny number of serious adverse reactions. Those advocating immunizations against biological attack could not show such clear benefits. Only the risks were certain. An otherwise healthy group of men and women received shots to protect against a health threat that might well never materialize. Other nations had calculated the risks and benefits and come to different conclusions. Britain made anthrax vaccinations for its troops voluntary. France's soldiers did not get them at all. Pentagon leaders had seriously underestimated the anthrax vaccine program's technical difficulties. Making vaccine in a tough new regulatory environment was a daunting business, as Bioport's continuing struggles showed. Stephen Joseph, the Pentagon health official, had hoped that the anthrax program would mark the beginning of a new era in which immunizations were an element of military doctrine. But the anthrax vaccination seemingly had the opposite effect. Many Pentagon officials found it hard to imagine attempting another broad immunization program against, say, botulinum toxin anytime soon. Looking back after he left the Pentagon, Richard Danzig could only shake his head. He had not understood the full dimensions of the problems at Michigan when he pressed the case for inoculations in 1995 and 1996. In hindsight, the decision to broaden the program and immunize all 2.4 million active duty and reserve troops was a much closer call. Danzig believed that his original proposal to immunize the soldiers assigned to high-threat areas would have been more popular with servicemen, and the dwindling supplies of vaccine would not have been as harmful to a less ambitious program. In the last year of the Clinton administration, federal officials geared up to assess the effectiveness of the new civil defenses. In August 2000, they staged an exercise that a press release announced would cost $3.5 million, making it the largest emergency preparedness drill ever conducted. Operation Top Off, for top officials, would test more than the ability of a large American city to respond to a germ attack. It was to be a several-day consequence management extravaganza that would involve thousands of government employees from 28 agencies. The exercise would have been even more ambitious had it not collided with financial, logistical, and political realities. The exercise was Congress's idea. In 1999, after it had appropriated hundreds of millions of dollars to train first responders in cities throughout the nation, Congress had asked the Justice Department and the Federal Emergency Management Agency, in coordination with the National Security Council, to see if its investment in training and new programs was paying off. But by the time the elaborate exercise was scheduled, the novelty of tabletops and mock attacks was gone. 2 months before the drill, Attorney General Janet Reno and FEMA Director James Lee were the only two top officials committed to participating. As initially conceived, the exercise was to involve at least 3 cities.
At a conference in the spring of 1999, government officials and the contractors whom the Justice Department had chosen to handle the exercise, Science Applications International Corporation, mentioned previously, and Research Planning Incorporated, devised an elaborate scenario involving chemical, nuclear, biological, and cyber attacks in at least 3 and as many as 6 cities.
By the following May, the exercise had been scaled back to a covert biological attack on Denver and a chemical weapons strike in Portsmouth, New Hampshire.
Officials had also conceded that if top federal officials were to participate, Top-Off would have to run fewer than the planned 10 days.
They would keep secret the designated agents to be used, as well as the specific times and places of the attacks, to ensure an element of surprise and to make the tests as real as possible. The government's response to the hypothetical mustard gas attacks on runners at a charity foot race in Portsmouth on Saturday, May 20, 2000, was fairly effective. Though it took an exceedingly long time for the 170 victims of the bogus chemical sprayings to receive treatment, there were no riots and only limited chaos. After an FBI SWAT team stormed the fake hideout of the fake terrorist, the Group for Liberation of Orange Land and Destruction of Others, 2 postal workers being held hostage were released. Within 48 hours, order was restored. This, however, was not the case in Denver.
In Portsmouth, some 300 government officials had been mobilized for the exercise. In Denver, important parts of the exercise occurred only on paper. Although some 2,500 officials participated in the Denver drill, the diagnostic testing of the mysterious agent, the delivery of real medicine, and other key events in the exercise were only simulated.
The scenario opened on Wednesday night, May 17th, with a hypothetical lone terrorist release of Yersinia pestis, pneumonic plague, through the fresh air ducts of the Denver Center for the Performing Arts. By Saturday, May 20th, when role-playing began, virtual victims of the attack were filling the emergency rooms of Denver Medical Health Center and 2 other hospitals in the area, complaining of chills, cough, fever, and other undiagnosed flu-like symptoms.
Later that morning, the exercise continued as a maid at a make-believe motel that the contractors had set up at an abandoned Army facility discovered a dead man in the room she was cleaning. The 25-year-old man, actually a plastic mannequin, had blood and vomit around his mouth, a toe with gangrene, and skin lesions all over his body. Local police also found a weapon, terrorist literature, and instructions for making a spraying device in the room. The FBI was called to investigate, and a 4-block area around the motel was cordoned off.
By Saturday afternoon, some 500 people had checked into local hospitals for treatment. 25 of them had died. After the CDC's lab at Fort Collins confirmed that the cause of death was plague, 31 real staff members were sent to Denver to help treat the sick and dying and contain the epidemic spread. A public health emergency was declared. By late afternoon, some hospital staff were calling in sick. Antibiotics and ventilators to help people breathe were becoming scarce. Some doctors and nurses had begun wearing protective gear. The governor's office issued an order restricting travel by air, bus, and rail to and from the Denver area. The public health authorities told area residents to go to a medical facility if they felt ill or had been in contact with someone who was. Other citizens were told to stay home.
News alerts and press briefings were covered by a team of pseudo-reporters whose black satin jackets were appliqued with the words Virtual News Network, which is the phony news organization the contractors had added to the drill rather than risk interaction with real reporters, a prospect that one participant called as daunting as plague.
By Sunday, May 21st, although the CDC had alerted neighboring states to the outbreak and its cause, cases of plague were being reported in several states, in England and as far away as Japan.
Pushbacks of antibiotics from the national pharmaceutical stockpile that the Clinton administration had created the previous year arrived in Denver. Several hospitals reached full capacity. So did city morgues. Some 1,300 ventilators were being sent to the area, almost half the nation's supply.
By the day's end, more than 1,800 cases of plague were reported. Almost 400 people had died. By Monday, the area's healthcare system was shutting down from the strain, but the city and state had still not approved a distribution plan for antibiotics. Police were worried about rioting and people stealing precious antibiotics.
The public health authorities encouraged the residents of Denver to wear face masks or, since those too were in short supply, the Bronco bandanas so popular in the football-crazed, cowboy-loving state. The CDC urged the governor's office to quarantine Colorado, but state officials refused, complaining that no provisions for shipping in extra food and extra supplies had been made and that such an edict would not be enforced.
Police were worried about rioting and people stealing precious antibiotics. The medical system, government offices, and society itself were collapsing. The exercise ended on Tuesday, May 23rd, as the epidemic spread out of control. Estimates of how many people got sick and died varied widely. Some reports registered an estimated 3,700 plague cases with 950 deaths. Other participants estimated that more than 4,000 were sick and that 2,000 had died, almost twice the official death toll.
Federal, state, and local officials lost little time in proclaiming the catastrophe was a successful exercise. While the 10 days in May's scenario had lasted only 4.5 days, the drill had, in government preparedness parlance, stressed the nation's emergency management system to its limits. Reflecting on the value of the drill, Richard E. Hoffman, the chief medical officer of Colorado's Department of Public Health and Environment, said that much had been learned thanks to the planning group's decision to select the weapon he had recommended, which was plague, a highly contagious agent. All diseases were not equal, nor did they affect society equally, he observed. An attack of anthrax, which was not contagious, would resemble a chemical attack in impact. Terrible as it was, anthrax could be contained. But plague, one of President Clinton's gifts that keep on giving, would be harder to stop. The drill had ended after the 4th day, Hoffman said, because, at least in this scenario, it was clear by then that you would never catch up.
A major lesson was that democracies were probably ill-prepared to make such emotionally charged decisions as whether scarce resources should be devoted to treating the sick or to trying to contain the epidemic. Top-Off showed that even well-prepared cities would be hard-pressed to do both.
According to several participants, the officials managing the outbreak had bitter, protracted fights over who would receive the antibiotics. Initial supplies had been rapidly depleted, and the state, everyone agreed, had been late in taking control of them. Most public health and emergency preparedness officials insisted that emergency management personnel, police, hospital staff, and their families had to have priority in getting drugs to enable them to remain healthy and cope with the disaster, as well as to encourage them to report for work. But others, especially elected officials, argued it was unacceptable to give the life-saving drugs to civil servants and their families when sick people needed them and the population remained unprotected. The politicians were overruled, perhaps only because Governor Bill Owens, a Republican who was skeptical of the Clinton Biodefense Initiative, had refused to participate in Top-Off. Instead, political advice was offered by a group of senior advisors in his office. Not all participants were happy with the selection of plague. Tommy F. Greer, Jr., who was the director of the Colorado Office of Emergency Management's Department of Local Affairs, said, "Gut-wrenching doomsday scenarios that overwhelm a city and its healthcare system are easy but not really helpful." He believed that Operation Top-Off would have been far more useful had a more realistically scaled and hence more likely scenario had been chosen.
The Denver metropolitan area had received more than its share of emergency preparedness training. All three of the cities involved in the drill, Denver, Aurora, and Colorado Springs, were among the first 120 American cities to have been trained under the congressional program. In 1993, Denver had skillfully handled a papal visit, and in 1998, an international presidential summit and the Oklahoma City bombing trial.
Several participants felt that failing to include real reporters had been a mistake, since without them there was no way to gauge how the scenario's unfolding events would be conveyed to the public. Top-Off had been very expensive. Tommy Greer Jr.'s Office of Emergency Management which got a $200,000 grant to offset the drill's costs, wound up spending far more than just that, and far more than the Justice Department officially acknowledged, many officials agreed. The federal government's own figures show that Top-Off's real cost was closer to $10 million, and much of it was spent on contractors.
While state and local officials had worked fairly well together during Top-Off, there was tension among public health officials, hospital representatives, and the FBI. They not only inhabited different worlds, but spoke different languages. Many public health workers, for instance, were unfamiliar with and frustrated by the steady repetition of the alphabet soup of emergency preparedness. "We weren't all exactly singing Kumbaya," said Greg Moser, a counterterrorism specialist in Colorado's Office of Emergency Management. Moser and most other experts said that Top-Off, especially its failures, had taught them invaluable lessons. As in New York's real outbreak of West Nile virus, the endless conference calls involving up to 100 officials had been time-consuming and cumbersome. But often there was no other way to communicate. Phones in the overworked public health offices and even police stations went unmanned. Most of Denver's hospitals had no contingency plans for treating mass casualty incidents and only limited stocks of equipment, vaccines, and other drugs. Only 3 of Denver's 22 hospitals had been able to spend the time and money required to participate in Top-Off, and one of them, overwhelmed by real patient loads, had had to drop out prematurely. Few of the city's morticians had even thought about coping with such an incident. The city's decision to commandeer refrigerated trucks from the Coors Brewing Company for body storage and transport was an inspired stopgap measure, but hardly a viable solution to emotionally and politically sensitive decisions about how and where to dispose of victims' bodies. Our public health care infrastructure was in some ways better prepared in the 30s to handle an epidemic like this than they are today, said Tara O'Toole, a public health expert who evaluated the exercise. The national antibiotic stockpile, which faced its first test in Top-Off, passed but barely. While the CDC sent drugs to Denver within 48 hours of the request, an impressive achievement, the plane landed at Denver International Airport, which the mayor's office was about to close. Furthermore, the drugs could not be distributed quickly. There were few workers on hand to divide the giant antibiotic push packs into manageable sizes. A public health worker went to Safeway to buy plastic bags in which the antibiotics could be distributed. The trip, Top-Off organizers estimated, would have taken 6 hours through streets clogged with panicked citizens. Officials complained about too many competing operations centers and not knowing who was in charge. There was also tension over making the right public health decisions and the need to make them quickly. Despite all of Denver's training, plans for isolating contagious people and getting drugs to ordinary citizens were not in place. Plans the contractors imposed, which had worked in New York, proved inappropriate for Denver. The designated points of distribution for antibiotics could serve only 140 people in an hour, utterly inadequate to the demand generated by a city of 2 million. When the exercise ended, officials were still arguing about whether a quarantine should and could be imposed on Colorado. People who hypothetically had already been confined to their homes for 72 hours were running short of food and supplies. Civil unrest was brewing. Hospitals were about to be stormed. Despite all of its previous training and drills, Denver was doomed. The disarray of Top-Off came as no surprise to Amy Smithson, an analyst at the Henry L. Stimson Center in Washington. After 18 months of interviews with public health and emergency preparedness officials in more than 30 cities across the nation, she had concluded in the fall of 2000 that the administration's directives and Congress's new laws had produced a hodgepodge of programs that were often conceptually dubious, bureaucratically duplicative, poorly coordinated, and disastrously implemented. A Southerner who loved politics and had witnessed several national security fads come and go in her 15 years in Washington, Smithson recognized a hot new trend when she saw one. The president's personal engagement meant there would be billions of new dollars available for agencies desperate to reinvent themselves after the Cold War.
Aum Shinrikyo's 1995 sarin gas attack in the Tokyo subway and the 1998 bombings of 2 U.S. embassies in Africa helped the administration push huge budget increases through Congress to prevent terrorism and deal with its consequences. The political imperatives were obvious. Who could possibly be opposed to fighting crazed zealots who were targeting Americans? No lawmaker or administration official wanted to have to explain in the aftermath of a devastating attack that lives could have been saved if only the government had not been pinching pennies. It was simply far easier for Congress and the executive branch to create new programs.
Overall, the funding for counterterrorism rose from $6.5 billion in 1998 to $9.3 billion in 2001, while the part of that devoted to managing the consequences rose from $645 million in 1998 to $1.6 billion in 2001. The experts most involved in pushing for stronger defenses against biological attack knew there would be waste. The government, several said privately, was slow to move and certain to stumble as it took steps in a new direction. Even so, Smithson and some of the government's auditors felt that some of the initiatives were notably wasteful. Some of the first, most trenchant criticism came from the General Accounting Office, the congressional watchdog. In a series of reports and statements in late 1997, the GAO warned that the administration's program was based not on a rigorous assessment of the terrorist threat facing the nation, but rather on the potentially infinite vulnerability of American civilians at home and U.S. armed forces abroad. Without cogent risk and threat assessments, the GAO argued, there was no way of knowing whether the government was spending too little, too much, or just enough money fighting terrorism, much less whether the money was being spent effectively. The GAO reports underscored the singular nature of the bioterrorist threat. Despite huge investments in intelligence and readiness, there was probably no way to predict with confidence the source of an attack, its target, the agent that would be used, or, therefore, how best to defend the nation. Many analysts noted that attacks using germs and unconventional weapons had been extremely rare, what national security experts termed a low-probability event. When the culprits had used or tried to use such agents, they had usually not chosen substances that would inflict mass casualties. Data collected by the Center for Non-Proliferation Studies at the Monterey Institute of International Studies showed that there had been 285 incidents throughout the world since 1976 in which terrorists had used chemical or biological weapons. In 44% of those cases, no one had been killed or seriously injured. In 76% of them, 5 or fewer people had been hurt. Examining these numbers, many analysts argued that there was little statistical support for the not if but when school of thought.
Amy Smithson and other analysts, though critical of such exaggerations and hyperbole about biothreats, at the same time also believed that given the rapid advances in biotechnology and the collapse of the Soviet germ warfare empire, as well as the rise of a smaller but sophisticated South African program, the past might not be prologue.
Statistics showed that although the number of terrorist incidents had declined in the past decade, their casualty rates had increased sharply. And America was increasingly often the target of such attacks. However low the probability of such an unconventional strike, the consequences might be so grave that any responsible government would have taken steps to protect the American people. Smithson's quarrel with Congress and the Clinton administration focused on how they had gone about it. To begin with, only $315 million of the $8.4 billion that the government spent on counterterrorism in the year 2000 was devoted to training people in cities and states to respond to a covert bioterrorism attack. Less than 4% was being spent beyond the Washington Beltway. A disproportionate share of this spending went to what public health advocates derided as the whistles and sirens, the fancy cars, faulty detectors, and other marginal gear. Only 6% of the funds to combat unconventional terrorism was allocated to strengthening the public health infrastructure, the heart of meaningful biodefense preparedness. The 1996 law that called for training of emergency personnel in the nation's 120 largest cities had proposed a simple structure. The Defense Department was in charge. But within 4 years, Smithson discovered, that statute had spawned a cottage industry of competing programs. Local officials could choose from among some 90 different courses offered by competing federal bureaucrats. The courses, moreover, differed dramatically in quality and content, but no federal office was charged with evaluating them or helping cities decide which best suited their needs. Government contractors, the so-called Beltway bandits, were often allocated the bulk of the training money, leaving cities and states scrambling to find funds to buy protective clothing and emergency preparedness equipment. Smithson argued that the administration had shortchanged hospitals and public health in the early years. Financing for a national stockpile of vaccine and antibiotics had not begun until 1998, 2 years before the end of President Clinton's second term in office.
Efforts to revive the nation's ailing infectious disease surveillance system, critical to identifying naturally occurring and deliberately caused epidemics, did not begin in earnest until a year later.
The Department of Health and Human Services was not even included in discussions involving bioterrorism initiatives until late 1998, and it was another year before the agency had secure communications facilities in which classified information could be examined and discussed. Although they were well-intentioned, Smithson concluded the administration's Homeland Defense initiatives had become a triumph of political pork over preparedness.
In most federal programs devoted to countering terrorist threats, germ agents were lumped together with other weapons of mass destruction, such as chemical, radioactive, and nuclear arms. And biological weapons were usually little more than an afterthought, barely the caboose of the counterterrorism train.
The administration's effort to reduce the threat posed by former Russian germ scientists received generally higher marks than the scattered, duplicative domestic programs. But even this effort had its problems. While in 1991 Senators Nunn and Lugar had allocated money to preventing former Soviet unconventional weapons scientists from selling their arms or lethal expertise to rogue states or terrorists, the Clinton administration did not provide serious money for biological defense until years after the program was begun. At the State Department, funds for the Biological Non-Proliferation Programs, the Moscow-based International Science and Technology Center, and other scientific exchange and cooperation projects with former Soviet bioweaponeers, were reduced year after year as a result of budget battles between and within the executive and legislative branches. By 2000, annual State Department support for such projects reached a total of $12 million, its highest level, but still a pittance compared to major government efforts. The same was true at the Energy Department. Most of its non-proliferation funds went to Russian nuclear cities and programs. Very little was spent on biology.
Andy Weber's efforts to win the allegiance of former Soviet germ warriors had always been modestly funded. It began with $5 million in 1996 and grew to $12 million by 2001, just 3% of the cooperative programs aimed at Russia. Most of that money was spent on reducing the threat posed by nuclear or chemical weapons.
Although Russian scientists had repeatedly warned the administration that Iranian officials were hunting for experts, particularly those with recombinant skills involving plant and animal pathogens, the Department of Agriculture received funding for anti-bioterrorism programs only in 1999. And for 2 years in a row, either the administration's Office of Management and Budget or Congress had rejected the Agriculture Department's request for $70 million to expand and upgrade its own animal pathogen research and diagnostic center on New York's Plum Island. There was no shortage of funding or congressional support for the Pentagon's effort to create rapid reaction teams within the National Guard. By January 2001, more than $143 million had been invested in the project, which was racing ahead on an accelerated schedule. In their 1998 memo to Cohen outlining the concept, Army experts had said it would take 3 years to train and equip the new units, an exceptionally quick turnaround for such a sophisticated mission. Army officials overseeing the Guard program set an even shorter timetable and planned to have the first 10 teams ready for action by the end of 2000. In a bow to civil liberties concerns, the Pentagon had dropped the hard-charging acronym for the teams, RAID, for Rapid Assessment and Initial Detection, in favor of a much blander moniker. The new name, Civil Support Teams, was chosen to convey the Guard's subordinate role to civilians. In January 2001, the Department of Defense's Inspector General delivered an independent assessment of the project. It depicted an unmitigated catastrophe. The government's inspector generals are assigned the thankless task of auditing and reviewing the efficacy of federal programs. They are independent, and President Ronald Reagan once said he wanted them to be as mean as junkyard dogs. Most of the auditors are decorous in their criticism, their language restrained. The report on the National Guard initiative was unusually scathing, as damning an internal assessment as the Pentagon has ever made public. The Inspector General concluded that the office setting up the program had so mismanaged the effort that it should be disbanded. Despite the years of work and training, none of the 10 teams was ready to be sent anywhere. Because of management blunders, defective and inappropriate equipment, and poor training, the units that were supposed to be deployable by January 2000 might themselves be at risk in an urban catastrophe, the auditors found. Only 5 of the 10 teams had recruited all of their 22 members, and many of the members had not been able to participate in training exercises. Each team still needed some protective clothing. 9 of the 10 could not talk with headquarters because of lack of communications equipment. Only 2 teams had been given handheld equipment to detect biological agents. When they conducted their initial exercises, none had received the mobile labs containing the equipment needed to identify a potential germ agent. When the vans with this equipment, each unit costing $1.6 million, the cornerstone of the project, finally arrived, some of their air filters were installed backward. Each van was supposed to contain a glove box, a sealed compartment for examining a biological agent. But because the boxes were badly designed and too big, there was too little room for team members to work in the vans. Many team members, moreover, had no idea how to use or maintain the glove boxes, which arrived without manuals. The gas masks provided to the teams had never been tested and were equipped with incompatible parts. While the masks and the accompanying blowers probably would have worked when assembled, one team commander told the auditors, "I'm just not willing to bet my life on it." During training exercises, some teams were issued partially filled air tanks to supply their masks and had to get refills from local firemen, which made the guardsmen a burden to the people they were sent to assist. Microscopes turned out to be too large to be installed in the vans, and their attachments required 5 electrical outlets. The vans had only 3. As a result, the auditors said, many team members and their commanders, whom the report described as dedicated, highly motivated people committed to their missions, were demoralized. The inspectors noted that the commanders and their team members lacked confidence in the unknown, untested, and unsubstantiated reliability of the equipment that they were issued, not to mention the program's managers.
One of the main confusions was over how, exactly, the team would help local officials. The sophisticated detection equipment could be useful for testing biological samples, but the FBI, which had set up its own hazardous materials unit, told the Army in the fall of 2000 that it would not allow anyone else at the scene of an incident to collect evidence without its permission. The FBI reminded the Guard that it was the lead agency for the crisis management. Army officials disputed some of the Inspector General's findings. They said, for example, that they had addressed the problems with the microscopes by issuing each team tents that could be pitched next to the vans. The auditors questioned how this plan would work if a terrorist incident occurred, say, on a day of heavy rains or even high winds.
The Pentagon did not dispute the report's findings and moved to shut down the office managing the project even before it was officially filed. Charles L. Cragen, an acting Assistant Secretary of Defense for Reserve Affairs, charged with overseeing the National Guard, said in early 2001 that his organization was working with great perseverance to resolve the problems identified by the auditors and that many had already been fixed. Cragen blamed the failures on the pressure the Guard had been under to mount so many sophisticated teams for a complex mission so quickly. Guard officials said the technical problems had been largely resolved and that the civil support teams would soon be ready to carry out their mission. Another weakness in America's biodefenses was the continuing failure to produce a cheap, reliable detector that would sound the alarm if a germ attack was underway. The military had been trying to build such devices since the early days of America's offensive program. What the Pentagon wanted was a simple device like a smoke detector that could sniff the air and quickly identify a bug in a biological attack. Some progress had been made since the Gulf War, when commanders were startled to learn that they had nothing effective to warn them. But the detectors were still rudimentary, and the stakes were rising. In the early 1990s, officials planning America's defenses against germ attack envisioned a crucial role for biodetectors.
The United States could never immunize every citizen against every possible disease available to a terrorist or rogue nation. Detectors could be a key to building a credible civil defense.
If the public health authorities knew immediately that their city had been attacked, they could begin evacuations, quarantines, and treatments.
But for the moment, the American people were the nation's main means of detecting a biological attack. The alert would come through panicked visits to emergency rooms and reports of mysterious symptoms. In the case of anthrax, as the military knew all too well, such reports would come several days into the illness, too late for treatment. The Clinton effort initially focused on projects mainly for the military. What the commanders wanted was a detector that would give enough warning to allow soldiers to escape an attack unharmed or to don protective gear. A warning that was slower but still timely might give infected people enough time to take vaccines and antibiotics or other measures to save their lives.
The Pentagon had tested a truck-mounted lab to sniff the air, an airplane to track particulate clouds, and an electronic network at military bases that tied together many sensors to double-check results and lower the number of false alerts. All had serious flaws. In September 2000, the Pentagon's Inspector General criticized one of the more costly efforts. The Joint Biological Point Detection System, which used some of the most advanced technology, was developed by Lockheed Martin. By 2000, the company had begun to build the first installment of 970 detectors in a $1 billion program. But the Inspector General concluded that the prototype machine achieved only one of its 10 critical goals. It broke down repeatedly and often failed to identify lethal pathogens. Lockheed insisted it had done the best it could given the difficulty of the technical challenge.
Making any detector is daunting, mainly because the targets are literally everywhere. Even clear air contains billions of germs, and benign ones are hard to distinguish from the killers. That leads to false positives, or mistaken identifications. For the military in time of war, false warnings might be acceptable, but the last thing New York or Washington would need is a germ alert that turned out to be wrong.
Frustrated by the lack of progress, military planners eventually turned to the weapons laboratories that had invented the atomic and hydrogen bombs. In the 1990s, these labs had found new work by addressing threats of mass destruction, especially germ weapons. Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, a square mile of federal science in Central California, threw itself into the detector push. Zeroing in on genes, it sought to identify the most unambiguous signatures of microbial individuality, just as Venter had suggested to President Clinton at the Renaissance weekend dinner. First, the lab developed a means of mapping a microbe's genetic material with the same kind of equipment that was being used to decode the human genome. These signatures were then copied into artificially made snippets of DNA. When these snippets were mixed with a candidate germ that had been unraveled, say anthrax, the snippet would bind to the germ's genetic material, causing a bit of fluorescent dye to float free. Under proper illumination, the sample glowed. Livermore then miniaturized its invention, reducing a huge mass of tubes, bottles, and electronic parts to a device that could fit in a suitcase or a handheld detector. By 1999, the lab had perfected a small chamber with a silicon chip that, theoretically, could identify germs in 7 minutes. By 2001, it was packaged as HANA for Handheld Advanced Nucleic Acid Analyzer. Weighing 2 pounds, powered by batteries, highly computerized, HANA underwent field trials at several sites, including the CDC in Atlanta, the FDA, and Los Angeles County's Emergency Operations Office. Livermore announced that it would transfer its invention to a company that would make and sell the detectors. The small device was promising, but further testing was needed to determine if it was really a breakthrough. The election of George Bush in the fall of 2000 raised questions about whether the cooperative programs between American and Russian scientists could survive. A review by the new administration gave the effort a qualified blessing, but problems persisted on both sides of the partnership. There was no shortage in Russian political circles of critics who opposed closer dealings with America, and not just within Russia. Some officials in the Uzbek and Kazakh governments had also tried to undercut the cooperative threat reduction program by being less than cooperative on requirements that Congress and the Clinton administration had imposed. Despite quiet American pleadings, the Kazakhs by mid-2001 had still not ratified the treaty banning biological weapons. Uzbekistan, until the spring of 2001, had delayed signing an umbrella agreement under which cooperative assistance projects operated. But compared to Russia, and despite occasional setbacks, the programs with the Central Asian states had made significant progress. In Washington, the gnawing suspicion that American aid was enabling Russia to do research that might benefit a weapons program continued to hinder the program. Weber himself had experienced disappointments that had given ammunition to critics of the program, and both the former Soviet institutes and the United States were to blame. Military labs were still closed to Americans. At the Stepnogorsk complex, which Weber had dreamed of transforming into the poster child for nonproliferation, the joint venture to manufacture pharmaceuticals collapsed before it got off the ground. A $3 million contract was canceled in 1997. Only $2 million of it was recovered. A plan to make disposable syringes in the former germ plant also collapsed the following year when production stopped because of unpaid utility bills. Another plan to sterilize up to 2 million syringes in yet another part of the complex failed because of inadequate financing and a shortage of cobalt-60, a radioactive isotope used to kill germs. However, the Pentagon was systematically dismantling the plant. By the summer of 2000, the massive fermenters had been removed and melted down for scrap metal. All equipment that could be used for making germ weapons had been destroyed. Filtration systems that once kept contaminated air inside the labs had been ripped out and were stacked high in piles of debris outside the production buildings. That year, Kazakhstan and the Defense Department had decided to raise the buildings. But negotiations had stalled over the price. While the plant no longer posed a threat, the same could not be said of its scientists and engineers. The Pentagon had helped destroy their life's work, but had given them almost nothing to take its place. There was no more work at the plant itself. The small, well-equipped toxicology lab that Washington had paid $750,000 to help open employed about 60 former germ warriors in downtown Stepnogorsk. Hundreds more needed jobs. The town's population had shrunk by half, and unemployment was still rampant. Weber and other American officials argued that the United States should do more to ensure that the weapons scientists who had made anthrax would be able to find peaceful work, hopefully in Kazakhstan. But the idea had little support in Congress, which preferred to invest money in dismantling dangerous facilities. In fact, the physical infrastructure of death was mostly gone. What remained unsolved was the more vexing problem of how to keep scientists from selling their expertise to Iran or elsewhere.
And that is the conclusion of Chapter 11 in the book Germs, which, in the softcover at least, ends on page 432. And as of the current date, May 2025, ends at minute 55 and 53 seconds in Chapter 5 of the Amazon Audible audiobook. 16 minutes of playtime remain for the following chapters, and the next chapter will be in episode 280.c for Chapter 12, which is titled The Future. And this concludes the recording of episode 280.b or 280.11 if you prefer in decimal for Chapter 11. Thank you for joining. Again, you can find the PDF, which corresponds to the softcover, available on Housatonic.live. And you can go to Housatonic.live and click on playlists, find the playlist page for Germs, and you can find a list of all of the episodes for this particular audiobook. Thank you for joining, and I encourage you to start the series from the beginning if you haven't already, and I appreciate all the people who help me support this program. Thank you very much. Take care. God bless.